Ladies and gentlemen, the Adfield Theatre is proud to present Nanny's Little Candle. It was her mum's idea to move.
New baby, new house.
That was the idea, though the baby wasn't Cassie's dad's. And Cassie did not have a dad anymore, not since he'd found out.
It'll be lovely. It'll be lovely. It's everything you didn't have in the town. Everything you've always wanted. Big garden, trees to climb. You can walk down the track and get the bus to your new school. It'll be simple.
But Cassie was 13 now. She'd wanted a tree in the garden when she was 8, but not now. It was as if her mum was unable to see that. Everything had to be new. Mum's new smile, mum's new plans, mum's new baby. Everything. Except for the bungalow at the end of the track. There was nothing new about that. It was from the 1930s. Small garden, bit of an orchard, all overgrown now. When the old lady who had lived there died, it stood empty. A year later, it was put up for rent with a large red sign at the end of the track. That's how Cassie's mum found it. It was in near ruin, but it was cheap. Everything the old lady owned was still inside the house. The beds and sheets had been removed, but everything else, chairs, table, cracked bar of soap on the windowsill, old pages from a woman's weekly taped to the wall, the TV licence pinned to one side of the kitchen mirror, even her calendar, filled with hospital appointments marked in black pen. It smelt damp. It felt damp.
It'll be better once we've got the place all clean and aired.
She said this often, and would go round the house singing cleaning songs as if she were a princess from some film. She opened a window, the panes filthy with years of dust and rain.
Listen, Cassie.
And Cassie had listened. But there was nothing. No sound but the birds singing and the insects clicking in the orchard. There was no street, no cars, no noise. There was nothing of their old life left at all.
You see, love? You see?
There was a cubbyhole in the kitchen with a couple of painted shelves and a 2-ring gas hob, lino tiles on the floor, and a key, a small rusted key that fitted no lock that they knew of. Yet there it was, hanging, knotted on a string in the larder, as if it had been there forever. Cassie's room was at the back. From her window she could see the orchard, thick with summer nettles and weeds. There were 13 apple trees, and beyond them, at the edge of the open field, a water butt and an old brick and plaster outbuilding with the roof fallen in. There was so much work to be done. The water and electricity would often stop working, and her mum would ring the renting agents on her mobile, though there was so little signal that she would end up shouting. Sometimes, after Cassie had gone to bed, her mum would ring Michael. Cassie did not know who he was, but her mum would often end up shouting at him as well. Then there was the baby, Niall, which sounded like the river. Cassie just called it the baby.
His name is Niall.
All she wanted was for Cassie to say his name, but Cassie wouldn't. If it wasn't for it, her life wouldn't have had to change. She would be back in her old house with her mum and dad, just the 3 of them, how it had always been. But it wasn't like that anymore. Her mum wanted her to hold the baby, but even the thought of it made Cassie sick.
Go on, have a go. He smells like biscuits and vanilla. Go on, you'll like it.
But Cassie wouldn't, and she almost didn't care that her mum cried, because the baby cried enough for all of them. He almost never stopped. That was what Cassie thought, at least. But what Cassie thought didn't matter anymore. She couldn't even talk to her old friends as there was no signal. She did the best that she could, lying in her bed with her music, with the baby crying and her mum trying to pretend that everything was perfect. And then Cassie found the little wooden box. It was in the outbuilding. She had to cross the orchard, moving the tall nettles with a stick as she went. The plaster on the walls of the outbuilding was rust-stained and blooming with yellow mould, and there was a large metal pot filled with a sludge of wet leaves that stank when she stirred them. The ground was littered with broken roof tiles and twigs, but in one corner was a wooden box, no larger than a shoebox. The wood was warped and weather-stained, and there was a little brass key plate on the front, locked tight. When Cassie shook it, it rattled. There had to be something inside. She brought it back with her.
There won't be anything in there. It's probably just old tools. How are you even going to open it?
At that exact moment, as if it had been whispered into her ear, Cassie remembered the small rusted key on the string in the larder. It was the right size. She placed it in the lock. The box opened, and disappointment followed. Inside the box were 4 old candles. That was all. They were wrapped in yellowed waxed paper, 3 white, 1 black. The black candle was greasy and dirty. Cassie had to wipe her fingers clean after touching it.
I said there wouldn't be anything worthwhile.
I think they're good.
The words came from Cassie's mouth, but she did not know why. She thought the candles were dull and dirty. But when her mum told her to put them back where she found them, Cassie didn't want to. They were hers now. She placed them carefully in the old lady's dressing table that still stood in her room. They were still there when she went to bed. She hadn't meant to light them, and if there were any batteries left for her torch, she wouldn't have. But when the electricity failed after dinner that night, they were the only candles she had. She didn't want to go to sleep in the dark. She lit the candles on a plate, almost burning her fingers on the last match as she lit the black candle. Cassie watched the shadows dance on the wall, and she heard the baby crying. Her mum started to sing for the baby like she had done for Cassie when she was sad, only she didn't sing for Cassie anymore. Cassie punched her pillow flat, and with the candles still burning and the shadows reaching out across the walls, she put her headphones in, turned up her music to drown out the sound of the baby, and closed her eyes. She let the words and the music wash over her. The sheets were cool and her body felt still. She lay there, silent, with the music in her head. But there was a line in a song she'd never noticed before. It came like a whisper at first. Someone was speaking along to the song, only the words did not fit. It was a reedy voice, like that of an old woman.
Snuffed out my light. Burn, little candle, nice and bright. Hangman's noose snuffed out my light. Burn, little candle, nice and bright. Hangman's noose snuffed out my light. Burn, little candle, nice and bright.
Over and over again, in the next song and the song after that. She knew this wasn't right. She was dreaming. She had to be. She opened her eyes, but even as she did, she knew the dream had continued because this was not her room anymore. It was a cold, bare kitchen, and where the dresser should have been, there was an iron cooking range with a shelf above it. A dirty rag rug lay on the cold stone floor. There was a chair and a table with a couple of house bricks upon it, red and brown. She knew the room was dark because it was night, but in the way of dreams, she didn't question for a moment that she was able to see everything quite clearly, right down to the colour of the bricks. On the shelf above the range was a black candle, its flame burning with dirty, greasy smoke, as if it were made of fat and skin instead of wax. Its flame drifted lazily in a draught, but it cast no light, no shadow. If anything, it made the room darker still. She lay staring at the kitchen and candle. As she watched, the door latch lifted, and an elderly woman entered. She was dressed as no one dressed any more, in a long thick skirt with a black bonnet and shawl, and she was carrying a leather bag. She placed it on the table. There was something inside the bag, but Cassie couldn't see what it was. She could hear Niall crying. Now she had to listen to him in her dreams as well. But it was as if the woman could hear it too, because she glanced irritably down at the bag as though she thought the sound came from inside it. But the woman did nothing about it. She emptied her purse on the table and began counting out coins, crossed the room and put them in a jar on the shelf beside the candle. The flame guttered darkly. Only then did the woman look back at the bag. There was a different expression on her face now, wicked and deliberate. She lifted her eyes and looked straight at Cassie. Cassie could only watch as the woman took a cloth down from the shelf and began folding it into a small pad. When she had finished, she walked back to the table and opened the bag. The crying was louder. Cassie realised that the crying was coming from the bag and not from Niall. With one hand, the woman held the bag open, and with the other, she reached in with the pad of cloth, pressing it down. She stood there for as long as it took for the crying to stop. She looked up at Cassie with a smile, a cruel smile. Picking up the bricks, she placed them into the bag and snapped the clasp shut. Then Cassie wasn't in the kitchen anymore. She was standing on the riverbank by a deep pool. It was dark and it was cold. She was watching the leather bag sinking out of sight. With a start, she opened her eyes. The ripples in the dark pool, the riverbank, they had all vanished. There was sunlight on the pillow by her cheek. She bolted upright and looked around the room. Her breath stuck in her chest. There was nothing. No range, no rug, no table. In that moment, she could have said exactly where they'd stood, but even as she looked, the image faded and disappeared. It was just her room with sunlight streaming in. But she was shaking. On the dresser, the candles had melted and run over the plate into a filthy mess. The room stank of burning stale fat. She got out of bed, the lino damp and cold on her feet. She rushed to open the window. Retching, she began to take in great lungfuls of the fresh outside air. She felt sick.
It must have been the candles.
They had studied carbon monoxide at school. Maybe it was like that. She could have died and no one in the world would have known. It had been like a poison. She heard crying like the crying from the bag. Her tongue felt fat and dirty in her mouth. Her head pulsated. She sat on her bed and tried to forget the dream. She still didn't feel well when it was time for her mum to go into town to get the shopping.
You're fine, Cassie.
I'm telling you, Mum, I can't go shopping.
You've done this before, Cassie, and I'm not falling for it again.
It was the candles. I had this dream. There was an old lady. She had a baby in a bag. She killed it, Mum. She killed it and threw it in the river.
Her mum's face had gone white pale, like it only did when she was really angry, and there was nothing Cassie could say or do to put it right.
How dare you suggest something like that? You vicious, ungrateful, spoilt little brat.
With that, Cassie's mum took the baby and drove off, leaving Cassie alone. That's how it always was now. Cassie all alone, her mum with the baby. It wasn't like that before. It had never been like that. Her mum swung out of the drive angrily, and Cassie's mouth tasted of the dirty wax. Cassie sat on the wooden back step, listening to her music for what could have been hours. She wished her mum would return. She wanted to apologise. As the day wore on, Cassie felt more and more uncomfortable. She was alone, she knew that. So why did she feel like someone was there? Then, quite clearly, from inside the bungalow behind her, she heard the sound. Her baby was crying. For a moment she thought it must be her mum, only there was no car.
Mum?
There was no answer, only the sound of the baby crying. It wasn't the same racket that Niall made. This was fainter, more sickly, like the mewing of a kitten. Cassie rose unsteadily to her feet. She stood in the doorway and listened. The sound was coming from along the passage, coming from her bedroom. Cassie walked down the passage. She was concerned not for her own safety, but for whatever animal was making such a weak noise. She paused by the door to listen. She turned the handle and opened. She was looking once more at the old flagstone kitchen. But it was day now. The woman was there. Shawl and skirt and button boots. She didn't seem to notice Cassie. She was pouring hot milk from a pan into a stoneware baby's bottle. Cassie could see the baby in a basket on the floor at her feet. The milk was far too hot. Cassie could see the steam rising from the pan.
You can't give a baby scalding milk.
The woman turned, looked straight at her and smiled. Suddenly, the woman, the baby, the iron range and the bottle were all gone. It was just her room and her bed and the sunlight. She began to question what she had seen, if it had even been there at all. It was like when you see a shape from the corner of your eye, and when you turn, there's nothing there. That's how it was for Cassie. The woman was there, then she was gone. Cassie's head was pounding. She wanted to cry. She didn't want to be alone. She had to leave. Cassie took her back door key down from its hook, locked the door behind her and made down the track towards the road. There was a shop in the village, but before she reached it, she came to the small church. The church had a bench. She could sit there in the sun and watch for her mum. She sat, waiting, listening to the sound of a lawnmower cutting the grass in the churchyard. It gave her no comfort, but she drifted all the same. She awoke to the church clock chiming. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was a little marble statue of a girl holding a dove. Cassie had not noticed it before. She stood up and, drawn to it, read the inscription.
In memory of the infants of the Weir Pond, June 1888.
There was a weir in the river on the other side of the church. She'd seen it from a distance. A pool with willows on the banks. She was struck with a terrible feeling. She knew this place. A dark pool with willows growing on the banks, a leather bag sinking out of sight. Something cold had touched her. She looked again at the date and the style of clothes the little girl wore, button boots and a shawl. Cassie could taste the dirty black wax in her mouth. There were no names on the marble. It just said infants. Cassie turned to the man who'd been mowing the grass. He'd put away the mower and was returning up the path, flat cap in hand.
Excuse me, what's this about? What's this statue?
He kept walking. Cassie felt foolish and angry at the man for ignoring her like that. But then a car drove past the churchyard. It was her mum's car. Cassie's mum was already unpacking the shopping when Cassie got through the door. She spoke only in short statements, not caring for a reply. She didn't even look at Cassie. This is how things had been since the baby.
I gave a lift to a lovely old lady. She was walking along the road back from town. Had a big leather bag, and I thought, you can't carry that. So I gave her a lift. We have to get to know the locals now we live here.
She didn't so much as glance at Cassie as she spoke, so Cassie said nothing.
She was so lovely about Niall. She loves children, especially babies. She knew all about the old cottage that was here before this one, and that's where the outhouse comes from, she says. She was a real mine. In fact, I've asked her to come for tea tomorrow. If I like her and she's good with Niall, I might ask her to look after him from time to time. Give you a break. After all, you're not exactly keen, are you?
She looked straight at Cassie that time, intending to make her feel guilty. But that was not what Cassie felt. She felt the emptiness, the darkness, and it was all lit by a black, greasy candle.
What's her name?
Cassie was nervous to speak. She could only picture the old woman from her dream carrying her leather bag.
She just said to call her Nanny Candle. Isn't that sweet?
Before she went to bed, Cassie made sure to throw the plate with its mess of dirty wax out of the window as far as she could. She heard it land. Then she scrubbed her hands clean and lay in her room with the light on. She couldn't sleep. All she could think of was the old woman. Through the walls she could hear Niall crying. Only if she listened carefully, she could hear other crying too, faint and far away. Crying that would stop and start again. But it was never the same cry. There was always something different about each one. Her thoughts drifted to the stone-floored kitchen and the iron range. She could almost see the shape of them rising out of the hard light bulb lit room around her. At last, she pulled on her jumper and padded barefoot along the dark passage to her mum's room. She felt safe there. There was a small lamp by her mum's bed. The light from it was soft and butter yellow. Her mum was holding Niall. He was asleep. Cassie climbed into the bed beside her.
Please don't let that lady come. I dreamt about an old lady.
Cassie's mum shifted. She put her arm around Cassie. She felt warm, safe.
Don't be silly, Cassie. You didn't see her. She was nice. Just a nice old lady.
She isn't nice, Mum. Can we move away? I don't like it here.
Cassie began to cry. Her mum's face grew hard and she took her arm away from Cassie.
You're going to have to learn to like it. It's all we've got. That's the end of it.
Large wet tears fell from Cassie's eyes and hit the pillow. Her mum did not put her arm around Cassie again that night. It was just after 3 o'clock the next afternoon that the old woman arrived. Cassie had tried everything she could think of to make her mum change her mind, but it made no difference. The lady still came. She sat there at the little kitchen table her mum laid out. But was it the same woman from the dream? Cassie couldn't say for sure. She kept stealing looks at her, trying to decide, but she couldn't say.
Don't stare, Cassie. I'm sorry, Nanny. Cassie's left her manners somewhere else today.
Her mum would never have called someone Nanny before. It wasn't the sort of thing she did, but she'd done it several times.
Nanny, would you like some tea? Would you like some cake, Nanny?
It sounded false to Cassie, but the old woman just smiled, took the tea, took the cake, looked at Cassie and smiled some more.
Lovely little brother you got there.
His name's Niall.
Oh, I know that, Poppet. Your mum told me. I bet you love him to bits, don't you? You know, dear, if ever you needed me to stop by and look after him for a while, I'd never mind. It'd be a nice treat for me. Lovely little boy like that.
Her mum smiled. She picked up the empty teapot from the table and made for the kitchen.
I'll just go and get some more tea and maybe we can talk about that.
I'll get it.
But her mum had already gone, and it was just her and the woman. The old lady carefully sipped at her cup of tea, put it tidily down on the saucer, and looked at Cassie. But it was not the same woman who had been sitting there before. This was someone else completely. It was as if a bad dream was slowly blossoming in front of Cassie. The old lady from the dream and this other lady were both there, sitting on the same chair, both talking to her.
You lit it then?
Cassie stared at her open-mouthed. She felt giddy and sick. She could taste the dirty wax on her tongue. She could smell it in the air, the stale burning fat. The woman smiled, and Cassie had seen this smile before.
Nanny always leaves a little candle out to light her way back home.
The lady put a bony finger to her throat, and Cassie saw on the white of her puckered skin, there, underneath the collar of her dress, a vivid blue and black bruise. It went on a slant all the way around her neck.
Hangman did that for me, dearie. Hardly fair, when all I did was take those girls' little worries away. Their little mistakes.
She looked slyly at Cassie and sipped at her tea again. Only suddenly it was the lady who had come for tea and cake and was looking at her.
You're right, Papa, you look pale.
Then, as suddenly as before, it was the other face, cold and heartless.
Like your mummy's little mistake.
Cassie glanced at Niall, sitting innocently propped in his chair.
Take him too, if you like. Put him in my bag of bricks. That'll be the end. Nanny make it all better. You'll see.
Cassie stuffed her hands over her ears. What happened next, she couldn't say. Her mum was there. The table was flipped onto the floor. The old lady who had come to tea was pressed against the wall, flailing her arms at Cassie, trying to keep her at bay. Then Cassie was alone in the little room, amongst the shattered cups and dropped cake, listening to Niall crying from the passage and her mum showing the old woman out of the door.
I am so sorry, Nanny. I don't know what came over her. Please don't think badly of me for this. I'm so sorry.
Cassie had never seen her mum so furious. Niall was yelling blue murder in her arms, and Cassie couldn't begin to explain any of it. Her mum wouldn't listen.
You did that on purpose, Cassie. You just can't help yourself, can you? You always have to hurt me, don't you?
But she wanted to hurt Niall.
That's enough, Cassie. If you say one more word, you will be out of this house. Do you understand me?
She did not speak to Cassie again that day. She didn't even kiss her good night. Cassie went to bed that night, unloved and alone. And then the power went off again. She lay in her bed, frightened in the dark, listening to her mum moving around by torchlight, singing to Niall to stop his crying. Then her mum went back to bed and everything was quiet and dark. Cassie must have drifted, because when she opened her eyes, the moon had moved. Its light was now shining onto her pillow, but it didn't shine on her bedroom. It shone on a small kitchen with an iron range and flagstone floor and a candle flickering darkly on a shelf. She could smell the dirty wax. There was a leather bag and 2 bricks on the table.
Nanny make it all better.
Even as she watched, the latch on the kitchen door began to lift. She had to wake her mum, but she knew she wouldn't believe her. As the door began to open, Cassie slipped from her bed and hurried along the passage. Behind her in the dark, she could hear the sound of Nanny Candle's buttoned boots hitting the stone floor. Hear the sound of Nanny Candle picking up the bag and the bricks. Noiselessly, Cassie crept into her mum's room. If she hid Niall, Nanny Candle wouldn't be able to find him. She could keep him safe. The baby was asleep in his cot. He didn't so much stir as she lifted him out. He smelled of warmth and milk and biscuits and vanilla, and his hair was so soft. She could feel it against her face. Why had she never held him before? She wrapped his blanket around him and carried him to the back door. There was a place to hide there, under the back steps. Nanny Candle wouldn't find them there. Cassie carried him out into the cool dark and crouched with him under the steps. She held him tightly, but he began to stir.
Shh, she'll hear you.
But the baby began to make small waking sounds.
No, don't cry. Don't cry or she'll find you.
She could hear the sound of Nanny Candle coming. As Niall began to cry, Cassie folded the corner of his blanket over his mouth and held it there, pressed it down. She whispered to him over and over again, rocking him in her arms, until finally he made no sound at all.
Hangman's news. Hangman's news. Hangman's news. Hangman's news. Hangman's news.
Thank you for listening. This has been Nanny's Little Candle, featuring the following cast. The narrator, Malcolm Lord. The mother, Deborah Watson. Cassie, Grace Turner. Nanny Candle, Debbie Jones. Editor, Gordon McComb. Adapted for the Atfield Theatre by Tom Evans and Becca Plaisted. Based on a short story from the book The Wrong Train, written by Jeremy deQuidt.